I saw my engagement necklace sitting on a folding table with a neon sticker that read, "Worn out, $10." And I smiled, because they had no idea what they were trying to get rid of. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried the smell of brewed coffee and freshly cut grass down our quiet suburban street. And neighbors moved from table to table with paper cups in hand, chatting casually as if this were just another harmless Saturday ritual, as if nothing of value was quietly being dismantled in plain sight. Ashley stood near the cash box, her posture relaxed, her voice light and friendly as she greeted each passerby, playing the part of the gracious host perfectly, while Daniel lingered behind her, pretending to rearrange a stack of old books he never once glanced at, his eyes carefully avoiding mine every time I stepped closer. I had woken up early that morning, like I always did, out of habit more than necessity, and I remember standing in my kitchen watching the sun rise through the blinds, telling myself that this garage sale was a good idea, that maybe it would bring a sense of order back into a house that had felt too large and too quiet ever since my husband passed away 6 months ago, that maybe this was Ashley's way of helping, of including me, of making me feel like I still belonged in a home I had lived in for over 40 years. I even made a fresh pot of coffee and set out a plate of muffins, thinking we might sit together for a moment before the day began, like a family. But by the time I came outside, the tables were already arranged, the boxes already opened, and my things, my life, were already laid out for strangers to pick through. At first, I didn't think much of it. I told myself it was just old dishes and used linens, things that had been sitting in cabinets for years. But then I started to notice a pattern, the way every item on those tables seemed to carry a piece of my past, my memories, my choices, while nothing that belonged to Ashley or Daniel ever made its way out of the house. I saw the china set I received on my 25th anniversary, priced at $15, the quilt I hand-stitched during a long winter when Daniel was a boy, folded neatly with a $5 tag. And still I said nothing, because I was trying to understand, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, trying to believe there was some innocent explanation I just hadn't seen yet. And then I saw it, resting between a box of mismatched earrings and a stack of costume jewelry, my engagement necklace, the delicate gold chain catching the morning light in a way that made it impossible to ignore, even from a distance, and that bright sticker, carelessly slapped onto its velvet case, labeling it as if it were nothing more than a forgotten trinket. Worn out, $10. I felt something shift inside me, not a sharp pain, not even anger, but something quieter, colder, like a door closing somewhere deep in my chest. And for a moment, I just stood there, watching as a woman picked it up, turning it over in her hands, squinting at it like she was trying to decide if it was worth even half the price. I didn't rush over, I didn't correct her, I didn't say a word, because I wanted to see how far this would go, how far they would take it, how easily they could reduce something that had once symbolized a lifetime of love and commitment into a $10 afterthought. I glanced at Ashley, expecting, hoping, for some sign that this was a mistake, that she would notice, that she would step in and fix it, but she just smiled at the woman and said, "Everything's negotiable," her tone casual, almost cheerful, as if she were talking about a used coffee maker or an old lamp. Daniel shifted slightly behind her, his hands stuffed into his pockets, and for a split second, our eyes met, and I saw it there, the hesitation, the flicker of something that might have been guilt, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by the same distant expression he had worn for months now, ever since he stopped calling me Mom and started addressing me like I was a guest in my own home. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, letting the sounds of the neighborhood wash over me, the laughter, the low hum of conversation, the rustle of dollar bills changing hands, and I realized something in that moment that I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. This wasn't about cleaning out clutter or making space. This wasn't about helping me move forward. This was about something else entirely, something deliberate, something planned. And as I stepped closer to the table, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of that velvet case, I let my smile settle into place, calm and unreadable, because if they thought they were simply selling off a piece of old jewelry, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I did not take the necklace right away, not yet. Instead, I left it exactly where it was and stepped back just enough to watch what would happen next. Because sometimes the truth reveals itself more clearly when you stop trying to control it and simply observe who people become when they think no one is paying attention. The woman holding it tilted her head slightly, her fingers tracing the chain as if testing its weight, and then she said, "It looks old, but it might clean up nicely." And I heard Ashley laugh softly, the kind of polite laugh she used with strangers, the kind that never quite reached her eyes, and she replied, "Honestly, we just need to clear things out, so if you want to make an offer, we are flexible." "We," she said, as if any part of that necklace had ever belonged to her, as if she had any claim to the life that piece of jewelry represented, and I felt that same quiet shift inside me grow steadier, more defined, like something settling into place. I moved slowly along the table, pretending to straighten a stack of old magazines, giving myself a reason to stay close without drawing attention, and I noticed how neatly everything had been arranged, how deliberate it all was. Nothing random, nothing accidental, each item chosen, placed, priced, as if someone had carefully curated a version of my life that could be dismissed, discounted, and carried away in small paper bags. A man in his 50s picked up the china set and asked Daniel if it was complete, and Daniel shrugged, barely glancing at it, and said, "I think so. It has been sitting around for years," as if those plates had not held every holiday meal, every birthday dinner, every quiet Sunday morning we had shared as a family, and I watched him say it with that same detached tone, like he was talking about something he had never been a part of. I remembered the first time I used that china, how nervous I had been, how carefully I had set the table, wanting everything to be perfect, wanting to create something warm and lasting for my husband and our son, and now it was just another item to be bargained over, reduced to a question of whether it was worth $10 or $20. The woman with the necklace set it back down eventually, deciding against it, and for a brief moment, it lay there untouched again, the gold catching the light in a way that felt almost defiant, and I felt an unexpected sense of relief, not because it had not sold, but because it had given me more time to see, to understand, to confirm what I was beginning to suspect. I glanced toward the driveway where a small group had gathered around a table of tools, and I heard Ashley explaining that they were downsizing, that it was time to let go of things that were no longer needed, and her voice carried just enough for me to catch every word, and I realized that she had already created a narrative, a simple, reasonable explanation that made everything they were doing sound practical, even responsible. And I almost admired how easily she wore it, how naturally. She stepped into that role. Daniel nodded along when people spoke to him, offering short answers, never elaborating, never correcting, and it struck me then how much he had changed, or perhaps how much he had allowed himself to become something else entirely, something quieter, something more convenient for the life he had chosen with her. I moved closer to the cash box, watching as Ashley counted a small stack of bills, her movements quick and efficient, and I noticed how she kept everything close to her, the money, the transactions, the decisions, as if she had positioned herself at the center of it all without ever having to say so out loud. A neighbor I had known for years, Mrs. Carter, approached me with a concerned expression, her eyes flicking toward the tables before settling on me, and she said softly, "I did not know you were planning to let go of so many personal things." And there was something in her tone that told me she understood more than. She was saying that she saw the imbalance, the quiet displacement happening right in front of us. I smiled at her, the same calm, measured smile I had been wearing all morning, and said, "Sometimes things are not what they appear to be." And she studied my face for a moment longer, as if trying to read what I was not saying, before giving a small nod and stepping away. I turned back toward the table where the necklace still rested, and this time, I reached for it, my fingers closing gently around the velvet case, lifting it with a familiarity that no price tag could erase, and I held it there for a second, feeling its weight, its history, everything it carried that no one else in that driveway could possibly understand. I did not hide it. I did not make a scene. I simply removed it from the table as if it had never belonged there in the first place. And in that quiet, almost invisible motion, something shifted again, not just inside me, but in the way I saw everything around me, the tables, the people, the carefully constructed story that had been unfolding all morning. Because now I was no longer standing on the outside trying to make sense of it. Now I was inside it, fully aware, fully present, and for the first time since the day began, I was not reacting to what they were doing. I was deciding what I would do next. The necklace felt different in my hand than it had just moments before, not heavier, not lighter, but clearer somehow, as if holding it again had returned something to me that I had not realized was slipping away, and I slipped it quietly into the pocket of my cardigan, smoothing the fabric as if nothing had happened, as if I had simply adjusted something small and insignificant. And then I looked up and took in the scene around me with a new kind of attention. The tables were still crowded, the same neighbors moving from item to item, the same low hum of voices drifting through the air, but now every detail stood out with sharp precision. The way Ashley leaned slightly forward when someone reached for an item, guiding their attention, controlling the conversation without ever appearing forceful. The way Daniel stayed just behind her, present but not involved, as if he had learned that silence was easier than choosing a side. I watched as a young couple approached the table with the linens, the woman running her hand over the fabric of a tablecloth I had used every Thanksgiving for nearly 3 decades, and she smiled, saying it would be perfect for hosting dinners in their new home, and Ashley responded with enthusiasm, telling them it had been well loved but rarely used lately. And I felt the weight of that phrase settle in my chest, not because it was entirely untrue, but because of how easily it erased everything that came before it, how it reduced years of meaning into a simple justification for letting go. I moved slowly toward the edge of the driveway, giving myself a bit of distance, and from there I could see the entire layout, the careful organization, the flow of people, the rhythm of transactions, and it became impossible to ignore what had been building quietly all morning. This was not just a sale, it was a transition, one that I had not agreed to, one that had been decided without me, and now was being carried out in broad daylight with polite smiles and reasonable explanations. I thought back to the conversation Ashley and I had a week ago, how she had sat across from me at the kitchen table, her voice soft, her expression concerned, suggesting that it might be time to simplify, that the house had too many things for one person. And I remembered nodding slowly, not because I fully agreed, but because I trusted her intentions, because I believed she was trying to help. And now, standing here, watching strangers carry away pieces of my life, I understood how carefully that conversation had been framed, how gently the idea had been introduced, how easily I had been guided toward acceptance without ever realizing what I was actually agreeing to. A man approached Daniel with a set of tools, asking if there were more inside, and Daniel hesitated for just a second before saying, "We are still going through things, there might be more later." And that single word, "we," echoed in my mind again, reinforcing what I was beginning to see more clearly, that decisions were being made collectively, just not with me included. Mrs. Carter passed by once more, this time carrying a small box, and she gave me a look that lingered a second longer than before, a quiet acknowledgement that something about all of this did not sit right, and I returned the look with a slight nod, not needing to explain, not needing to confirm, because sometimes understanding does not require words. I turned back toward the house, my eyes tracing the familiar outline of the front porch, the windows, the door I had opened and closed thousands of times over the years, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were seeing it from the outside for the first time, not as my home, but as something that was gradually being redefined without my consent. Ashley's voice carried across the driveway again, cheerful and light, thanking someone for their purchase, and I noticed how easily she moved through the space, how naturally she occupied it, as if she had already stepped into a role that had not yet been openly acknowledged. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the velvet case, grounding myself in something that still belonged entirely to me, something that had not been negotiated, not been priced, not been handed over. And in that small, quiet contact, I felt a shift in my thinking, not a rush of emotion, not a dramatic realization, but a steady, deliberate clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop questioning what you are seeing and start accepting it for what it is. I looked at Daniel again, really looked at him, at the way he avoided my gaze, at the way he deferred to Ashley in even the smallest interactions, and I understood that whatever had changed between us had not happened overnight. It had been building slowly, quietly, over time, just like this moment, just like this morning, and now it had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored or explained away. I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and straightened my shoulders, not in defiance, not in anger, but in recognition of where I stood, Because if they believed this was simply about clearing out old belongings, if they believed I would continue to stand by and watch as my life was reduced to price tags and polite conversations, then they had misunderstood something fundamental. And as I turned and began to walk back toward the house, leaving the tables, the customers, and the carefully staged narrative behind me for the moment, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided for me. It would be decided by me. I closed the front door behind me with a quiet click, and for a moment, the sounds from outside softened into a distant hum, like the entire scene had been placed behind glass, still visible, but no longer pressing against me in the same way, and I stood there in the entryway, letting the stillness settle, letting my eyes adjust to the familiar space that now felt subtly different, not because anything had physically changed, but because I was seeing it with a clarity I had been avoiding for far too long. The living room looked exactly as it always had. The same arrangement of furniture, the same photographs lining the shelves, the same soft light filtering through the curtains, and yet I noticed the small gaps, the absence of items that had quietly disappeared over the past few months, things I had assumed were misplaced or stored away, things I had not questioned because questioning would have required me to confront a possibility I was not ready to face. I walked slowly across the room, my hand brushing along the back of the sofa, tracing a path I had walked countless times before, and I paused in front of the mantel, where a row of framed photos captured moments that once felt permanent. Daniel as a child with a gap-toothed smile, my husband standing beside me in the garden we had planted together, holidays, birthdays, ordinary days that had felt full at the time. And I studied those images now not with nostalgia, but with a careful attention, as if I were searching for the point where something had shifted, where the thread that held all of this together had begun to unravel. I moved into the dining room next, the table still set from earlier that morning when I had placed out the muffins and coffee, untouched now, the cups cooled, the napkins still neatly folded, and I stood there looking at it, realizing how that small moment had carried an expectation I had not fully acknowledged, the hope that we might sit together, talk, share something simple and genuine before the day began. And how easily that expectation had been bypassed without a word, without even a pause. I reached for one of the cups, lifting it briefly before setting it back down, the gesture automatic, almost symbolic, and then I turned toward the hallway, my steps measured, my thoughts steady, no longer circling in confusion, but aligning into something more structured, more intentional. As I walked past the staircase, I noticed a box tucked neatly against the wall, one I had not seen before, its lid slightly ajar, and I stopped, crouching down just enough to lift it, revealing a collection of smaller items inside, jewelry, keepsakes, things that had not yet made their way to the tables outside, and I recognized each one immediately, not because they were valuable in any traditional sense, but because they carried pieces of my life that no one else could fully understand. I closed the lid gently, setting the box back exactly as I had found it, and I felt that same quiet certainty deepen. This was not random, not careless. This was a process, one that had been unfolding gradually, one that had been allowed to continue because I had not stopped it. I stood up and walked toward the bedroom at the end of the hall, the door slightly open, and as I stepped inside, the air felt different, still carrying traces of my husband's presence in a way that had been both comforting and painful in equal measure, and I paused at the edge of the bed, my gaze settling on the nightstand where his watch still rested, untouched, exactly where he had left it, and I felt a brief, steadying breath move through me, not a wave of grief, but a reminder of something solid, something that had not been defined by anyone else's decisions. I reached into my pocket and took out the velvet case, opening it slowly, the necklace catching the light just as it had outside. But here, in this room, it felt different, not exposed, not diminished, but restored to the context it had always belonged to. And I held it there for a moment, allowing myself to remember without being overwhelmed, to acknowledge its meaning without losing focus. Then I closed the case again and placed it carefully in the drawer, not hidden, not protected out of fear, but simply returned to where it should be, and I straightened up, my posture settling into something firm, something resolved. From outside, I could still hear Ashley's voice, the occasional laughter, the steady rhythm of people coming and going, and I knew that when I stepped back out there, nothing about that scene would have changed. The tables would still be full, the The prices would still be set. The story they were telling would still be in motion, but I would not be the same person who had walked out there earlier that morning, uncertain, hesitant, trying to understand. I walked back toward the front door, my steps even, my breathing calm, and as my hand reached for the handle, I paused for just a second, not out of doubt, but to mark the moment, the quiet transition from observation to intention, because whatever happened next would not be shaped by what they had already set in motion. It would be shaped by what I chose to do with what I now understood. I opened the front door again and stepped back outside, and the sunlight felt sharper this time, not warmer, not brighter, just clearer, as if everything had been stripped of its softness, leaving only what was real, what was visible, what could no longer be ignored, and I walked down the steps at an even pace, my eyes scanning the tables, the people, the small exchanges of money and smiles that continued as if nothing had shifted at all. Ashley glanced up when she saw me return, her expression unchanged, still pleasant, still composed, and she said, "Everything is going really well. We have already sold quite a bit," her tone light, almost proud, as if she expected me to share in that satisfaction, and I nodded once, a small, neutral gesture that gave nothing away, because I was not there to argue, not there to question, not yet. I moved toward the far end of the table where a stack of framed photos had been placed, ones I had not noticed earlier, and I picked one up, a picture of Daniel at 8 years old, holding a small wooden model airplane we had built together over the course of an entire weekend. His face lit up with that unfiltered joy that children carry so easily, and I held it there for a moment, looking at it not with longing, but with recognition, recognizing the distance between that moment and the man, standing a few feet away from me now, recognizing how much had been lost, or perhaps how much had been set aside. A man approached me, asking if the frames were included, and I looked at him calmly and said, "They are not for sale," my voice steady, not raised, not defensive, just clear, and he nodded, stepping back without question, because certainty does not need explanation, and I set the photo back down, but not in the same place, not in the same position, a small shift, barely noticeable, but deliberate. I continued along the table, stopping at different points, picking up items, examining them, and with each one, I made a quiet decision. Some I left exactly where they were, others I moved slightly closer to me, creating a subtle line, a quiet boundary that no one had announced but that I was beginning to establish all the same. Ashley noticed eventually. Of course she did, her eyes following my movements more closely now, her smile tightening just enough to reveal the change beneath it, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly as she said, "We already priced everything earlier, so it is easier if we keep it consistent." And I turned to her, meeting her gaze fully for the first time that morning, and I said, "Not everything," my tone calm, measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and for a brief moment, the air between us shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough that she paused, just for a second, before her expression smoothed out again. Daniel looked up then, his attention finally drawn into the exchange, and he said, "Mom, we talked about this. It is just stuff. We are trying to help." And I let his words settle for a moment before responding, not with contradiction, not with emotion, but with clarity. "You are helping yourselves," I said quietly, and I watched as that landed, as it moved through the space between us, not loud, not confrontational, but undeniable in its simplicity. Neither of them responded immediately, and around us, the sale continued. A woman laughed at something a neighbor said. A car door slammed somewhere down the street. The ordinary rhythm of the morning carrying on, as if this conversation were just another small detail in a much larger picture, but I could see it now, the slight shift in Daniel's posture, the way Ashley's hand tightened briefly around the stack of bills she was holding, the way both of them became just a little more aware of me than they had been before. I did not press further, I did not need to, because this was not about winning an argument in the middle of a driveway. This was about something far more measured, far more deliberate, and I turned slightly, my attention returning to the tables, to the items, to the quiet process I had begun, and I continued, one piece at a time, reclaiming what had never been theirs to give away in the first place, not with force, not with confrontation, but with presence, with certainty, with a calm that could not be dismissed or redirected. And as I moved, as I chose, as I quietly redrew the lines they had tried to erase, I could feel the balance shifting, not outwardly, not yet, but beneath the surface, where the real decisions were made, where the story they thought they were writing was beginning, slowly, to change direction. The shift was quiet, but it was there, threading through every movement, every glance, every exchange that passed between us. And I could feel it as clearly as the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The way the atmosphere had changed just enough that nothing felt entirely effortless anymore. Ashley no longer moved with the same ease, her gestures still polished, her voice still warm, but there was a tension now, subtle but present, in the way she watched me out of the corner of her eye, in the way her smile held for just a fraction too long before fading. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed caught somewhere in between, his posture uncertain, his attention divided, as if he were trying to maintain the version of the morning he had agreed to while also beginning to register that it was no longer unfolding the way he expected. I continued to move along the tables, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present, and with each item I touched, I made a decision, quiet and final. Some I returned to their place, others I set aside, not in a pile that would draw attention, but in a way that subtly removed them from the flow of the sale, as if they had never been intended for it at all. A woman approached, reaching for a small jewelry box that had belonged to my mother, and before her fingers could close around it, I stepped slightly forward and said, "That one is not available," my voice calm, almost conversational, and she paused, looking at me with a brief moment of confusion before nodding and moving on, accepting the boundary without question because it had been stated with certainty, not apology. Ashley noticed immediately, of course she did, and she moved closer, her tone still measured but no longer as light as before. "We should keep things consistent, otherwise it gets confusing for people," she said, and I met her gaze again, steady and unyielding, and replied, "It is only confusing if you do not know what belongs to you." And the words settled between us with a weight that did not need to be raised to be understood. Daniel shifted again, stepping forward this time, his voice lower, more cautious. "Mom, we are just trying to make things easier for everyone." And I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I saw not the man he had become, but the boy he had been, the one who used to look to me for guidance, for reassurance, for clarity, and I realized that somewhere along the way, that connection had been replaced with something far more distant, something shaped by convenience rather than understanding. "Easier does not always mean right," I said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a correction, but as a simple truth, and he did not respond, his eyes dropping briefly before turning away, as if the effort to hold my gaze had become too much. Around us, the morning continued, neighbors chatting, cars passing, the ordinary sounds of a quiet street carrying on as if nothing significant was happening. And yet beneath it all, there was a shift in awareness, a growing recognition that something about this scene was no longer as straightforward as it had seemed. Mrs. Carter returned once more, this time empty-handed, and she stood beside me for a moment, her presence steady, and she said softly, "It is a lovely piece, that necklace," her eyes meeting mine with a knowing look, and I nodded. "It is," I replied, and nothing more needed to be said, because some acknowledgments do not require elaboration. Ashley busied herself with another customer, her movements slightly quicker now, her focus sharper, as if she were trying to regain control of the rhythm she had established earlier. But the balance had already begun to shift, and I could see it in the small hesitations, the brief pauses, the way she recalibrated after each interaction. I continued, one item at a time, not reclaiming everything, not disrupting the entire process, but choosing carefully, deliberately, drawing a line that was not loud or dramatic, but firm enough that it could not be ignored. And with each choice, with each quiet correction, I felt a growing sense of clarity, not about what they had done, because that had already become clear, but about what I would allow moving forward, about the boundaries that had gone unspoken for too long, about the space I occupied in this house, in this family, in this life that had been slowly redefined without my consent. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue or explain, because the shift was already happening, not in the surface details of the sale, but in the underlying structure of who held authority, who made decisions, who defined what mattered and what did not. And as I stood there, calm, steady, fully present, I knew that whatever they had planned, whatever assumptions they had made about how this day would unfold, they were beginning to realize, quietly but unmistakably, that they had miscalculated something essential. By late morning, the sunlight had shifted just enough to cast longer shadows across the driveway, stretching the legs of the folding tables and softening the edges of everything laid out upon them. And with that shift came a subtle change in the pace of the sale, the early rush slowing into a steadier flow, fewer people, longer conversations, more time for things to be noticed, more time for what had been overlooked to come into focus. I stood near the center of it all now, not at the edges, not observing from a distance, but fully present within the space they had arranged, and I could feel the difference in how people approached me, the way they glanced toward Ashley first and then back to me, uncertain for a moment about who to address, who held the authority to answer, and that uncertainty, small as it was, mattered. A man picked up a set of silverware that had belonged to my grandmother, turning it over thoughtfully, and he asked, "Is this real silver?" And before Ashley could step in, I answered, "Yes, it is, and it is not for sale." My tone even, leaving no space for negotiation, and he nodded, placing it back with care, offering a polite smile before moving on, and I noticed how Ashley paused just a fraction too long before redirecting her attention elsewhere. Daniel lingered closer now, no longer standing entirely behind Ashley, but not quite beside her either, as if he were unsure where he belonged in this new arrangement, and every so often, he would start to say something, then stop, his words dissolving before they fully formed, and I watched him with a quiet understanding that did not excuse what he had allowed, but acknowledged the complexity of how he had arrived here. A younger woman approached, holding up a small wooden box I had once kept letters in, and she asked if it came with what was inside, and I stepped forward, taking the box gently from her hands, opening it just enough to confirm what I already knew, and then closing it again before saying, "This one stays," and she nodded, stepping back without protest, because certainty, once again, does not invite argument. Ashley let out a small breath, barely noticeable, but I heard it, the faint exhale of someone recalculating, adjusting to a situation that was no longer following the script she had prepared, and she said, "We are trying to keep things simple today," her voice still controlled, but carrying a hint of strain beneath it, and I turned to her, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Simple does not mean careless," I replied, and the words settled between us, quiet but firm, drawing a line that could not be smoothed over with polite language. Around us, the neighbors continued their browsing, their conversations, their small exchanges of cash and thanks, but I could sense the subtle shift in their awareness, the way a few of them lingered a little longer, listening without appearing to, observing without making it obvious, because people notice more than they let on, especially when something feels just slightly out of place. Mrs. Carter stood near the edge of the driveway, speaking with another neighbor, but her eyes flicked toward me more than once, a quiet presence, a steady witness to what was unfolding. And I found a certain comfort in that, not because I needed validation, but because it confirmed that what I was seeing was not imagined, not exaggerated. It was real, visible, undeniable. I continued to move through the tables, not taking everything back, not dismantling the entire sale, but choosing with intention, leaving some items where they were, allowing certain things to go, because not everything needed to be reclaimed, not everything needed to be held on to, and that distinction mattered, because this was not about possession, it was about recognition, about deciding what could be let go and what could not be taken without acknowledgement. Daniel finally stepped closer, his voice low, almost tentative. "Mom, we can talk about this inside." And I looked at him, considering the offer, not dismissing it, but not accepting it either, and I said, "We are talking." And he fell silent again, the simplicity of the response leaving no room for deflection, no opportunity to move the conversation into a space where it could be softened or redirected. Ashley adjusted the stack of bills in her hand, her movements sharper now, less fluid, and she turned to a customer with a smile that felt slightly more forced than before, her attention divided in a way it had not been earlier, and I realized then that the control she had assumed was no longer complete, that the balance had shifted just enough to disrupt the ease she had relied on. I reached the end of the table and paused, looking back over everything, the items, the people, the carefully arranged scene that had started the morning, and I could see it now not as a single, unified effort, but as a series of choices, some made by them, some made by me, intersecting in a way that was no longer predictable, no longer entirely within their control. And as I stood there, calm, steady, fully aware, I understood that this was no longer just about what had been placed on those tables. It was about what had been assumed, what had been decided without me, and what I was no longer willing to let pass without acknowledgement. And that understanding, quiet as it was, carried a weight that would shape everything that came next. The afternoon settled in slowly, the light turning warmer, softer, but nothing about the air felt relaxed anymore. Not for me, not for them, because beneath the quiet rhythm of small sales and polite conversations, something had shifted into place that could not be undone, and I could see it in the way Ashley checked the cash box more frequently now, her fingers moving faster, more precise, as if she were trying to regain a sense of control that had slipped just out of reach. Daniel stood closer than before, no longer drifting at the edges, but not fully stepping forward either, his presence uncertain, as if he was waiting for something to resolve itself without having to take part in it. And I recognized that hesitation, not as weakness, but as avoidance, the kind that grows when choices have already been made but not yet fully acknowledged. A woman approached with a stack of folded linens, asking for a discount if she bought all of them together, and Ashley smiled, beginning her usual negotiation. But before she could settle on a price, I spoke. Those stay. My voice calm, steady, not raised, and the woman looked between us, surprised for a moment, before setting them back down without protest, and Ashley's smile faltered just slightly, the edges tightening before she recovered. We agreed to clear things out, she said, her tone lower now, controlled but no longer light, and I turned to her, meeting her gaze fully. You agreed, I replied, and the distinction settled between us with a clarity that did not need to be repeated. For a moment, neither of us moved, and in that stillness, I could feel the attention of those nearby shift subtly in our direction, not openly, not directly, but enough to be felt, enough to make it clear that this was no longer just a private misunderstanding. It was something visible, something that could not be quietly smoothed over. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice more firm than before, though still careful. Mom, this is not how we talked about it. And I looked at him, holding his gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a steady recognition of what had been left unsaid between us for too long. No, I said quietly. It is not. And I let that be enough, because explaining would only invite denial, and I was no longer interested in debating what was already clear. A car pulled up at the curb, a new set of neighbors stepping out, bringing with them fresh attention, fresh movement, and Ashley turned quickly to greet them, her voice lifting again into that practiced warmth. But it did not carry the same ease as before. There was a slight strain now, a carefulness that had not been there earlier, and I realized that she was no longer leading the moment, she was reacting to it. I moved along the table once more, my hand resting briefly on items as I passed. Not to claim them all, not to take everything back, but to mark what mattered, to draw a quiet boundary that did not need to be announced to be understood, and with each step, the line became clearer, not just for me, but for them. Mrs. Carter approached again, this time standing beside me without speaking at first, her presence steady, and after a moment, she said softly, "Some things are not meant to be sold," and I nodded. "No, they are not," I replied, and the simplicity of that exchange carried more weight than any explanation could have. Ashley watched us from across the table, her expression composed, but her eyes sharper now, measuring, calculating, and I could see that she was beginning to understand that this was not a moment she could manage with charm or convenience. This was something that required acknowledgement, something that could not be redirected with a smile. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a small gesture, but one that spoke of discomfort, of something unsettled, and he looked at me again, as if searching for a way to bridge the space that had opened between us. But I did not step toward him, not yet, because this was not the moment for reconciliation. This was the moment for clarity. I reached the end of the table and turned back once more, taking in the entire scene, the items that remained, the ones that had been taken, the people who still lingered, and the two of them standing within it, no longer fully in control of the narrative they had set in motion, and I felt that quiet certainty settle into something firmer, something that would not shift again. This was not about stopping the sale entirely. It was not about reclaiming every object or undoing every choice. It was about something deeper, something that could not be placed on a table or assigned a price. It was about understanding where I stood, what I would allow, and what I would no longer ignore. And as the afternoon light stretched further across the driveway, casting long shadows that blurred the edges of everything laid out before us, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what had already happened, but by what I chose to do with it. And that choice was no longer uncertain. It was already forming, quiet, steady, and impossible to dismiss. The shadows had grown long by the time the last few customers drifted away, their cars pulling off slowly, leaving behind an emptier driveway and a quiet that felt different from the stillness inside the house earlier. This one carried the weight of what had just happened, of what had been revealed in small, undeniable ways throughout the day. The tables were no longer crowded, the items that remained spread out with more space between them, and I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, not with exhaustion, not with relief, but with a steady awareness that something important had shifted, something that could not be undone simply by packing everything back into boxes and carrying it inside. Ashley closed the cash box with a firm click, her movements controlled, but there was a tightness in her posture now, a careful precision that had replaced the ease she had worn that morning, and she said, "We did well today," her voice measured, as if stating a fact might restore the sense of order she had started with. And I looked at her calmly. "Did you?" I replied, and the question lingered, not demanding an answer, but leaving space for one that did not come. Daniel stepped forward, glancing between us, his expression uncertain. "It was just a sale, Mom. We can talk about everything else later." And I turned to him, meeting his eyes fully, not avoiding, not softening, and I said, "No, this was not just a sale." And I let the silence that followed settle without filling it, because sometimes what is not said carries more clarity than anything spoken in haste. The evening light cast a warm glow across the driveway, softening the edges of everything, but it did not blur what had been made clear, and I moved toward the table once more, my hand resting lightly on the surface, feeling the worn wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the present moment, in the reality that stood in front of me rather than the version of it they had tried to present. I reached into my pocket briefly, touching the absence where the necklace had been earlier, knowing exactly where it was now, safely returned to where it belonged, not because it needed to be hidden, but because it had never belonged out here to begin with. And that simple act, quiet and unnoticed by most, felt more significant than anything that had been said all day. Ashley exhaled slowly, her composure holding, but thinner now. "We were trying to help," she said, and I nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting their meaning. "You were trying to decide," I replied, and again, the distinction settled between us, clear and unyielding. Daniel looked down briefly, then back up, as if searching for something to say that would bridge the space that had opened. But there are moments when no bridge can be built without first acknowledging the distance, and he remained silent, his uncertainty no longer hidden behind distraction. I stepped back slightly, giving myself a fuller view of the scene, the tables, the items that remained, the space that had been cleared, and I realized that what mattered was not what had been sold or kept, not the money collected or the things removed, but the assumption that had driven it all, the belief that decisions could be made about my life without my voice, without my consent, without even my awareness. And that assumption had been the real thing laid out for display today. I looked at both of them, my gaze steady, not harsh, not accusing, but clear in a way that did not invite misinterpretation. This house, these things, this life, none of it is something you get to organize without me, I said quietly, and the words did not rise, did not demand, but they held, solid and immovable, like something that had finally been set in place after too long left undefined. Ashley's expression shifted then, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that she understood the weight of what had been said, that this was no longer a situation she could guide or manage with careful language, and Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, as if something he had been holding had finally been acknowledged. even if he did not yet know what to do with it. The evening settled further around us, the street quieter now, the activity of the day fading into a stillness that felt earned rather than empty. And I turned toward the house, my steps unhurried, my posture steady, not retreating, not withdrawing, but simply moving forward with a clarity that had not been there before. I paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back once more, not at the items, not at the tables, but at them, standing there in the space they had tried to define, and I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumption or convenience. It would be shaped by understanding, by boundaries that had finally been spoken, and by a presence that would no longer be overlooked. And as I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, I understood that what they thought they had been. Selling today was never just a collection of old things. It was a test of whether I would allow myself to be quietly moved aside, and the answer to that, now, was unmistakably clear.